Week 2, Unit 3, Exercise 1. The bitter irony of the nature-nurture wars of the 20th century was that a world where nurture was everything would be horribly more cruel than one where nature allowed people to escape their disadvantages through their own talents. How peculiarly nasty to write people off because they were born in a slum or fostered by indifferent parents. The society depicted in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is usually mistaken these days for one of fatalistic genetic determinism. In fact, it is the very opposite, a place where early nurture for the elite produces unfair advantages. Fortunately, we know from the work of the economist Gregory Clark that elites regress inexorably to the mean over time. Despite sending their children to elite preschools, the richest of the rich in a city like New York can do little to make up for their children's genetic mediocrity. And despite getting little opportunity, brilliant kids from the slums can make it big. Nature is the friend of social mobility. Exercise 2. The expanding nature of digital technology meant new forms were constantly surfacing and rapidly diversifying. As Dieter Daniels wrote regarding the growing complexity of current digital media, it is impossible to take in the whole picture. No technology has ever unfolded its potential as swiftly as computers. In contrast to traditional tools, which retain their form and function for hundreds of years, the computer has changed dramatically in a short space of time. There was, as pioneering artist Mark Wilson suggests, a bewildering variety of computational techniques available to the artist. Throughout the history of computer art, it seems that artists have often struggled with the morphology and tempo of digitalization. For the theorist and artist, it was difficult to follow the rapidly evolving nature of the technology and the sudden succession and redundancy of forms. Equally, the historian was faced with the difficulty of mapping these rapidly transforming and ever-expanding digital forms. This is perhaps why art historians have traditionally preferred subjects that evolved at a manageable pace. Exercise 3. One might say that a language predisposes us to think certain things, but perhaps its main effect is in causing us not to think certain things. It is well established that we fail to notice much of what goes on around us. Research on human decision-making shows that while we routinely disregard a portion of available information, this in fact makes good sense. Part of the logic of decision-making is to minimize the costs involved. It is the same from small things, like choosing which brand of cereal to buy, to big things, like finding a life partner. Once you have locked on to a decision-making problem, your next step is to find ways to narrow the search for an appropriate solution and lock off or stop the search by making the decision that yields the best balance, desired benefit for lowest cost. And you should make the decision quickly in order to get on with making the next incoming decision. Exercise 4. Few accounts of early human evolution depict males being fathers or sons, and yet every single one of our male ancestors was both of those things. That's not to say that early human fathers put as much effort into hands-on childcare as early human mothers did. But once the size of our ancestors' brains began to expand, it's likely that adult males began to live with mothers and children, and groups worked together to collect and prepare food. It seems to us that mothers would have needed help from adult males to get enough food for themselves and their larger-brained children. Chimp mothers are stretched to capacity finding enough food to keep their larger-brained babies alive. We reckon that Australopithecine mothers could have managed if they had worked together and got help from their older children. But it's hard to see how mothers could find enough food to supply the calories needed to support the growth of even larger-brained youngsters while at the same time supporting their own larger brains. Males were the only possible source of the extra nourishment. Exercise 5. Health researchers are increasingly examining how people move around the world and interact. They do this through surveys, mobile phone data, and satellite imagery. Soon, it will be possible to link this data with other information, from genome sequences to environmental analysis, to study infections across a range of scales. Rather than focus only on the biological features of a disease or its impact on a particular population, we will be able to simultaneously analyze the infection, its evolution, and its environment, as well as the behavior of its human patients. This will allow health agencies to design disease control strategies specifically for different populations and areas, and it will be particularly important in situations where a person's history of infection can influence their future risk of disease. Dengue fever is a good example. If you've previously been exposed to one strand of dengue, it can make your second infection more severe. That's why a 2016 study coordinated by the World Health Organization recommended that dengue vaccination campaigns should account for the history of infection within a population. Exercise 6. It was an amazing feat to get to the moon, stay there for a few hours, and return to Earth. The spacecraft for the 8-day journey was equipped with enough food, oxygen, and other necessities for the astronauts to survive. It's quite another undertaking for a colony of people to live indefinitely in space by growing crops and recycling water and wastes. One person consumes roughly 3 times his or her body weight in food, 4 times that weight in oxygen, and 8 times that weight in water, and generates 130 pounds of feces and 880 pounds of carbon dioxide in a single year. Clearly, the prospect of carrying enough food to eat, water to drink, and air to breathe for a colony of people is out of the realm of possibility, not to mention the difficulty of carrying away the waste. Even a single glass of water would require massive amounts of energy to lift into space. A colony living indefinitely in space or on another planet would need to grow its own food and cycle its water and wastes. Clockwork switches over to complexity. Exercise 7. If punishment were about promoting cooperation, we should simply punish unfair people. How much the other person's unfairness caused them to gain on us personally shouldn't impact our decision. However, as 2 psychologists, Nicola Raihini and Catherine McAuliffe, have found, this is not the case. Their experiment involved a 2-player game where one player could steal money from the other. The victim always suffered the same loss. However, the relative outcome varied. Sometimes the thief still ended up with less cash than their victim. Sometimes they had the same as the victim. And sometimes they had more. The study found that the victim's decision to punish the thief was strongly influenced by whether the thief ended up better off than the victim. People punished when they were made worse off by another person breaking a rule. They did not simply punish because the other broke a moral rule. Their punishment was not about increasing cooperation. It was about harming someone who had unfairly advanced ahead of them. Exercise 8. We recognize that groups divide as well as unite, and the intensity of our bonds within them may proportionately discourage relationships with non-members. This presents us with a distinctly utopian problem. Utopia is an idealized group characterized by enhanced sociability. But every in-group implies exclusion or an out-group. The attractiveness of the group may well be proportionate to its delineation of an antagonism towards its enemies. Germans, for instance, have been described as achieving a grand utopia of belonging in their united enmity of the Jews under Hitler. So every utopia is a potential dystopia. Affection for and loyalty to some may be defined by hostility towards others. Neighboring countries, rival football clubs, other races, religions, and nations. The last are particularly guilty here. The most ambitious and universalistic theories of sociability demand a moderation of the more primitive forms of national loyalty by cosmopolitanism to emphasize our common essential humanity, but often they fail and national enmity prevails instead. Exercise 9. Small mammals and insects live near one another, often in dense vegetation. Their hearing range extends into what humans call the ultrasonic because these high sounds reveal useful information about the close-at-hand environment. Social and breeding signals of these animals are therefore also ultrasonic. To human ears, for example, mice and rats seem almost entirely silent, but these animals have rich vocal repertoires, including play sounds, calls from pups to mothers, alarms, and breeding songs. Such high-frequency sounds travel very poorly in air, and so these sounds offer rodents good close-at-hand communication without revealing their locations. For animals that interact on larger scales, like humans and birds, lower frequencies work better for long-distance communication. Their ears, and thus breeding songs and calls, are tuned to lower frequencies. The diversity of sonic expression, therefore, reflects the varied ecologies of each species. Exercise 10. Human infants learn to distinguish between the living and the non-living using clues about how things move and noises they make. Dogs move differently from cars and make different kinds of noises, and how they interact with other objects. But the neurological machinery that draws these distinctions is far from perfect, so it is not always easy to distinguish between what today we call the natural and supernatural realms. Our brains are always on the lookout for agents, and it is so easy to make mistakes when we hear whispers behind us in the night. Why do iron filings creep toward magnets? Why do rivers in flood seem so angry? Dreams and hallucinations encourage us to believe in possibility of many types of purposeful beings. So does language, because grammatical forms tell us that actions require actors. In English, grammar forces you to say that the wind blows, the sun shines, the world spins, the pandemic spreads. Our minds have a bias toward overdetection agency because that is usually a less dangerous error than the alternative. Mistaking a log for a crocodile might cause some merriment, but mistaking a crocodile for a log could prove fatal. Exercise 11. One area in which veterinarians are professionally involved is the now almost worldwide trade in animals. They are often called upon to oversee such operations, sometimes required by law to do so. But Simon Coughlin shows how things can go radically wrong, not least of all when slaughter is unregulated at the place of destination, where few legal restrictions prevail. He reviews the controversy that was aroused by the footage of Australian cattle being abused in Indonesian abattoirs and illustrates one of the central problems with the live export trade, namely the lack of international agreement on the treatment of animals. While animals may be treated tolerably well in the farms they are raised on in one country, there is no guarantee that they will be treated well either in transit to or upon arrival in another country. At the very least, veterinarians should be at the forefront of calling for consistent animal welfare regulations internationally. It is often their voice, either individually or collectively, that is missing from such debates. Exercise 12. Storytelling is among the proudest of Indian traditions, and from ancient times it has been associated with impairing wisdom and worldly knowledge. When you read the Panchatantra tales as a child, it was impossible to miss the moral underlying each story. And the Mahabharata, the grandest, the most complex and multi-layered of epics, was merely a masterpiece of storytelling. It was, and remains, a discourse on life and living. The beauty of stories is that they teach without ever appearing to do so. Most of our early worldview and our moral compass have been shaped through the stories we heard in the laps of our mothers and grandmothers without us ever realizing it. We looked forward to bedtime story sessions because the tales enchanted and entertained us, and through them we learned without ever feeling the burden of formal learning. Preaching rarely works with children, and I suspect it works no better with adults. In general, we are resistant to being handed down wisdom in black and white terms.